Well, I would like to welcome you all to the Daughters of Utah Pioneers Museum. It's always exciting to have the first event of our season, and today we have a great presentation for you. A little bit about the museum. We're open 5 days a week from 10 to 5, and admission is free. So hopefully you will come back and visit the museum or stay later after the presentation, because what we have here is about the history of Washington County, which is the topic of our presentation today. A couple of housekeeping things. The restroom's right outside outside the door here. If you have a cell phone, if you would put it on Do Not Disturb or airplane mode, Loren will appreciate that. And so a little bit about the presentation today is of the history of Washington County. The presenter is Loren Webb, and he is a lifetime resident of St. George. And he has done presentations about the history all over the place. He teaches at the Utah Tech ICL courses. He's on the Washington County Historical Board. And he works at Gunlock State Park as a ranger and a guide. He does walking tours. I mean, the guy is just busy, and very, very knowledgeable. And he has prepared a great presentation for us. So without further ado, here is Loren Webb. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. I really appreciate Teresa, and I wanted to thank the Daughters of Utah Pioneers for sponsoring this lecture and for allowing us to meet in such a great facility. I've always loved the Daughters of Utah Pioneers Museum. And just one little clarification, I'm not a ranger out at Gunlock. I work in maintenance 3 days a week. I clean restrooms and pick up trash and help out in the booth sometimes, just kind of do a little bit of everything that they need. But it's been a really good experience. So most of what I'm going to tell you today about the history of Washington County is taken from Doug Alder and Carl Brooks' history of Washington County from isolation to destination. And then the latter parts, of course, come from me, from various sources that I've been able to acquire, when we're talking about such a general topic as the history of Washington County. So to start off with, so just a little bit about the geographical features. The geographic features are really quite interesting. I mean, we're talking about on the east, the county is bounded by the Hurricane Cliffs, and on the south by the Grand Canyon, on the west by the dry deserts of the Great Basin, and then on the north by the south rim of the Great Basin, which is, of course, was created by ancient Lake Bonneville. And then, of course, you have the black-covered Black Ridge, way over on the very northeastern part of the county. And of course, one of the major prominent features in the county is Pine Valley Mountain, which is a laccolith. So I've always loved Pine Valley Mountain. It is majestic, and had the opportunity to work for the Forest Service for 2 summers and maintain trails up there. And then between St. George and the mountain is a 7,000-foot difference in elevation. So quite a bit of difference here. Let's see, did that go twice? Yeah. Okay. So because Washington County is a desert, it's very dependent on the waters of the Virgin and the Santa Clara rivers for irrigation and culinary needs. As you know, if we have in the summertime, we pretty much don't get that much rain unless it's in mid-August or early August when we get some of the afternoon thunderstorms. So, and of course, the thunderstorms can change things dramatically. 1 minute you have no rain, and the next minute you've got 1 to 2 inches of rain, and you don't know what to do with it. I always check my drainage section in front of my home for the potential for flooding. Okay. So let's also talk about the early inhabitants of Washington County. So these were desert archaic peoples, the Anasazi and the Fremont cultures. Much later were members of the Paiute, Goshute, Shoshone, Navajo, and other tribes. And the evidence shows that they were around, they've been here for at least 10,000 years. These people generally organized themselves into small bands of several families. Their groups were limited in size because just of limited resources. We live in a desert. There were no nations or confederacies. The word tribe is a white man's characterization of people who spoke the same dialect and did not fight among themselves. And of course, the coming of the white people made it necessary for Native Americans to band more tightly together. These early Native Americans, and from the archaeological artifacts that we've found, some of Utah's historic Native Americans were named diggers by the whites who watched them digging for roots. They were very poor and they struggled for survival. They used minimal tools, but they had a great knowledge about animal habits. Their equipment ranged from poles and twigs and grass and bark. They, of course, put up domed wickiups that were made from poles and brush and clothing of cedar bark and baskets. They were seed beaters, mush stirrers, and they made containers for gathering, storing, winnowing, and boiling with their heated stones. They made watertight baskets that were smeared inside and out with pine gum. I thought that was really interesting. The quest for food, of course, kept them on the move, and so they often grouped their brush huts and their windbreaks near seed patches or pinyon trees while they harvested their pine nuts. They were few in number and peaceable, and they relied on shamans or medicine men to work with invisible forces. Their bows and arrows were used for hunting, but rarely for warfare. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Paiute women and children were sometimes taken by raiding parties of other tribes, such as Utes and Navajo, to be sold to the Spanish and the Mexicans on the Old Spanish Trail. And the Old Spanish Trail is still in evidence. I see it every time I go to Gunlock State Park. I see the evidence of that trail. While they sometimes raised corn, squash, and beans, the Indians lived principally on fish, birds, wild game, wild fruits, roots, and seeds. And of course, they used the rock grinder or metate and mano for grinding their corn, the mesquite beans, and the grass seeds for flour for making bread. The largest band of Native Americans in Washington County was the Perusites. The others, of course, were the Tonnequins, which is why we have the name Tonnequin down on the south end of St. George, the Paiutes and the Shivwits. And just so you know, the Shivwits are a band of the Paiutes. Okay, and of course, petroglyphs and pictographs. What's the difference between a petroglyph, and a pictograph? Yes?
One's painted, the other one's etched in.
Yes. Yep, that's the key difference there. Okay, so, and of course, you can look at the amount of time that it went into doing those type of things. And so we know that petroglyphs are found along many of the waterways through Washington County. I know of at least 3 that are publicly available. The Red Cliffs Anasazi site that's in the Red Cliffs National Recreation Area. That's near Harrisburg, Utah, now known as the Red Cliffs National Conservation Area. There's the Santa Clara petroglyphs via the Anasazi Trail near Ivins. That's maintained by the Bureau of Land Management. And then the Bloomington Petroglyph Park at 1460 West Navajo Drive. It's in Bloomington. How many of you been to any of these sites? Okay, wow, most of you. That's awesome. Okay, they're really interesting, aren't they? Okay, so let's talk about Dominguez and Escalante. So in the summer of 1776, you have 2 Catholic priests, Father Anastasio Dominguez and Father Silvestre Velez de Escalante, led a small expedition north from Santa Fe, New Mexico, through southwestern Colorado and into the Uinta Mountains, and finally over to Utah Lake. When they got to Utah Lake, they found very peaceable Utes. And the Utes invited them to come back, and they said, "We'll be back within a year." Did that happen? No. If it had happened, we'd probably be speaking Spanish today. Okay? But they, their destination had been Monterey, California, but because of a heavy snowstorm below present-day Delta, Utah, it forced, and it was actually between Delta and Milford, it forced a change of plans. And the new objective was to return to Santa Fe as quickly as possible by crossing the Colorado River. So they eventually, on their way back, they discovered the Virgin River, Ash Creek, Fort Pierce, and the Hurricane Fault. They left the area via the crossing of the Fathers near the modern-day Lee's Ferry in Arizona. So the aim of their aim, of course, was to establish a route between the two northernmost points that the Spanish Empire had in the American continent. Of course, Santa Fe in present-day New Mexico and Monterey, California. But like I said, just because of the bad weather, they were not able to come back. Okay, so Jedediah Smith was the next pathfinder to enter Washington County. His 1826 and 1827 trips overlapped Escalante's trail for short distances. On his first expedition, he followed the Virgin River through the Narrows, which is the present route of I-15. But guess what? He learned his lesson. Don't go through the gorge again. Okay? It's really difficult. So on his second trip, he avoided the Narrows. He went up through, he followed the Santa Clara River crossing, and he found a pass over to the Beaver Dam Wash, and he followed that down the Virgin River. And Smith named the Virgin River Adams River in honor of U.S. President John Quincy Adams. But apparently that name change did not last. Okay, so his pioneering trips opened a new route to the Pacific coast, and other explorers followed, such as George Yount. And it's possible, of course, that those explorations had a great deal to do with the development of the Old Spanish Trail. By 1844, you have Captain John C. Fremont of the U.S. Army passing through Washington County from California to northern Utah. And by then, the Spanish Trail was a very well-defined route over which annual caravans traveled back and forth from Santa Fe to the California coast. By 1848, Utah's Dixie was American territory, and with the discovery of gold in California in 1849, some gold seekers did pass through Utah's Dixie on portions of the Old Spanish Trail. In 1849-1850, LDS President Brigham Young sent an expedition led by Parley P. Pratt to southern Utah. He reported that Dixie had not only a mild climate, but a lot of suitable locations for settlement. And so by 1850, Parowan was settled. It became the mother community to southern Utah. Brigham Young then sent missionaries to the Southern Indian Mission at Harmony on the upper Ash Creek. In addition, he sent John D. Lee to settle Harmony in 1852, and because when John D. Lee got there and Jacob Hamlin and other missionaries like Rufus Allen got there, there was a conflict over mission statement, basically, over what the purpose was. John D. Lee wanted them to work with just building up the community of Harmony, and the Indian missionaries saw it differently. They said they felt like they needed to work with the missionary or the Indians, and so there was disharmony and harmony, if you will. And so the Indian missionaries got permission to move to Santa Clara, and that's why they moved to Santa Clara in 1854. Not because it was a better location. It's because they couldn't get along with John D. Lee. So, okay. This just kind of shows you some of the settlements that were settled there in Washington and other southern Utah communities. So I thought I'd give you just a chance to look at some of those names. Okay, so Mormon missionaries discovered incidentally that cotton would grow in this mild climate and low elevation. The missionaries' wives later came to Santa Clara, and settlers led by Robert Covington and Samuel Adair settled at Washington in May of 1857. And an experimental cotton farm operated 1 year later in Heberville above present Bloomington. So what had happened is that Jacob Hamlin had sent I can't remember who got sick, and maybe Teresa can help me, but somebody got sick, so they sent someone up to, I think, Parowan, and they found it in Parowan. A woman had some cotton seeds that she'd brought back, I think, from back east, and they used those to do their experimental farm in Heberville. So I thought that was really cool. Settlements such as Hamlin and Pinto, 1856. Washington, 1857. Heberville, Pintura, Tokerville, and Virgin, 1858. Grafton, Harrisburg, and Pine Valley, settled in 1859. Adventure, that's a really interesting name, right? 1860. Duncan's Retreat, Northrop, St. George, and Schunesburg, settled in 1861. And New Harmony, Rockville, and Springdale, settled in 1862, sprang up along the river as the Indian Mission gave way to the Cotton Mission. And additionally, you have Shoal Creek, later named Hebron, was settled in 1862 in the northwest part of the county. Leeds was settled in 1867, and Silver Reef was settled in 1875. Which community was a non-Mormon community? Silver Reef. Okay. So, the word Dixie in Utah can be linked to the growing of cotton in the area of Washington County. The area from Pine Valley on the north to the Virgin River Gorge on the south, and from Zion National Park to the Arizona Strip is often called Dixie. And it was called Dixie because a lot of the settlers came from southern states. They had expertise in growing cotton. And this area reminded them of the southern states, and that's why they called it Dixie. Okay, so Mormon leaders were searching for scores of new settlement sites to accommodate thousands of anticipated European and American converts. And the plan called for church members to live in villages wherever possible. And they would have their farms on the outside of the villages, because the villages provided protection from the Indians as well as helped to build a close-knit community. You can see, of course, the city of St. George town site. That's the original one. Using the village grid system for settlement, settlers drew lots for a town plot and acreage in nearby fields. They diverted the water onto the land, and they arranged temporary shelters for their families. So, okay, then Mormon missionaries began to interact with Shivwit Indians in Santa Clara. They helped with building a fort, damming the river, digging canals, clearing land, planting crops, and sending for their families from the north. Members of the Southern Indian Mission were accepted by the Shivwit Indians there. The Pedes or the Shivwits invited Jacob Hamlin and other Mormon colonizers to settle among them. So Jacob Hamlin, of course, was called to be a peacemaker with the Native Americans, and he helped to prevent major disputes between European Americans, Native Americans, and between tribes. Some of the Indians willingly accepted baptism into the Mormon church, but the missionaries became sad over the Indians' practice of selling children into slavery and fighting to the death over brides, as well as by the general rampant hunger and filth that plagued the Shivwits at that time. From 1854, when Thomas D. Brown and Jacob Hamlin were sent to Santa Clara to work with Native Americans, Mormons worked with local Shivwits, teaching them to farm, and had plowed and furnished seed and helped them to plant and irrigate. But always with the arrival of hot weather, the Indians went to the mountains. Each winter, the local people and the Central Tithing Office cooperated to give them from $400 to $600 worth of food and clothing. Most of the natives appreciated what was done for them, but Toab resented the white man and all he represented. The Mormon herds had eaten the grass and chased off the deer, he said. Later, Toab was accused of and convicted of killing a fellow Indian chief, Chief Quituz, and sent to the Utah Territorial Penitentiary. I love this picture right here because can anybody kind of guess about approximately what the address here is? If you look at the north-south area, it's definitely the Red Hill. I look at it as really close to about 400 East and about Tabernacle. 400 East and Tabernacle. Right? I mean, it's pretty cool. I just love that. I love that. It's one of my favorite pictures of early settlement. Okay, so the summer of 1857 was difficult because a large U.S. Army of about 2,500 troops under Colonel Albert Sidney Johnston were sent by President James Buchanan to put down a supposed Mormon rebellion in Utah Territory, and this led to what would be called the Utah War, which was essentially a bloodless war with one exception. And we're going to talk about that. So, into this difficult situation between the Mormon Church and the federal government, the Baker-Fancher wagon train with a large number of oxen, cattle, and people, passed through Utah in August, and they had difficulty all along the way. And much of the trouble grew out of the belligerent or hostile attitude of the Mormons and their refusal to sell supplies to the immigrants. But some of it was also attributed to the conduct of some of the travelers as well. They decided to take the southern route to California despite warnings of potential Indian difficulties. The relationship between the Mormons and immigrants deteriorated as the party journeyed through Utah territory, and a lot of this is because of the Utah War, the pending Utah War. The Mormons are afraid that the U.S. Army is going to come in and swoop down and attack them, just like they did, they experienced back in Missouri and Illinois, and going back into even New York and Ohio. So insults were exchanged and accusations made. Some of the travelers boasted of participation in earlier conflicts with Mormons in Missouri and even claimed a part in the killing of Mormon prophet Joseph Smith. So in Beaver, the Baker-Fancher wagon train was cautioned not to stop for fear of increased hostilities with local settlers. In Parowan, the company was not allowed to pass through town but had to break a new road around it. The friction in Cedar City resulted from the refusal of the townspeople to sell provisions to the immigrants because they were fearful, like I said, that the U.S. Army was en route to Utah territory at the time. And I kind of put this analogy out there. If you were driving to Southern California, you stopped at a convenience store and they refused you service, you'd be pretty upset, right? It's kind of the same way immigrants were when the Mormons wouldn't sell them any foodstuffs along the way. Okay, so the immigrants then stopped at Mountain Meadows, a mile-long meadow with lush grassland that allowed wagon trains to rest and feed their animals before they crossed the difficult Mojave Desert. While the train was there on September 7th, 1857, they were attacked by Indians and whites. You can read that as Mormons or the Utah militia. On September 11th, 1857, abandoning their weapons according to instructions from Mormons and proceeding under a flag of truce, about 120 men, women, and children were murdered. Only 18 small children were spared and later returned to relatives in Arkansas. The decision to attack was taken by local leaders. In their latest book, called Vengeance is Mine by Barbara Brown and Richard Turley, who had the full support of the LDS Church in writing this history, they came to the conclusion that there were only 17 small children that were spared. So this is in Doug Alder and Carl Brooks' book. So, okay, perhaps it was what happened? What caused the Mountain Meadow Massacre? And maybe it was because of revenge for harsh treatment the Mormons received in Missouri and Illinois in the 1830s, including the Hans Mill Massacre, where 17 Mormons were brutally murdered by an anti-Mormon mob. And then you have Missouri Governor Lilburn W. Boggs. He issued an executive order that the Mormons must be exterminated or driven from the state. By the way, that extermination order was not repealed until 1976. And 1840s, including the Mormons' expulsion from Nauvoo, Illinois, or it may have been hysterical fear of the army that was on its way west, or maybe it was pressure from the Indians who had allied with them to fight the coming war. Perhaps it was seen as a battle within the Utah War, or maybe it was just the possibility of getting booty that the immigrants were carrying. Well, what was the impact of the Mountain Meadow Massacre? Well, it resulted in ruining the reputations of many residents of southern Utah. Cedar City essentially became a ghost town because federal marshals were on the lookout. They came down to Cedar City with Judge Cradlebaugh, and Cedar City residents just fled. There were 9 warrants issued warrants issued for 9 individuals for Mormons. And of course, it destroyed the lives and property of the Baker-Fancher party. And John D. Lee was executed at the site for his part in the massacre in March of 1877. Okay, so on to more positive things. On October 6, 1861, at the semi-annual General Conference of the Mormon Church, Brigham Young called 309 families to go to southern Utah to establish a new community of St. George named after his counselor, George A. Smith. Smith was known as the Potato Saint for his generosity of giving potatoes from his farm to help people avoid scurvy. That 1861 wagon train company, which doubled the population of Utah's Dixie, was led by two Mormon apostles, Orson Pratt and Erastus Snow, to establish the Southern Utah Cotton Mission, or Dixie Mission, to raise cotton on a large scale near Tonnequint or Washington, especially since it coincided with the outbreak of the Civil War. The thought was it would help the Mormons to become self-sufficient if cotton could be produced in Utah. So, in May of 1861, Brigham Young visited Tonnequint at the confluence of the Virgin and Santa Clara rivers, where about a dozen families were living. He was deeply moved and prophesied, "There will yet be built between those volcanic ridges a city with spires, towers, and steeples, with homes containing many inhabitants." By 1862, the county seat was moved from Washington, where it had been since 1859, to St. George. Where was the first county seat located? Gunlock? No. No. That was... Yeah. Harmony. There we go. Harmony was the first county seat of Washington County. That's very good. So the St. George story is about building a Mormon regional capital in the South. It became the support to many other settlements, such as those on the Muddy River in Nevada, as well as a chain of communities on the Little Colorado River in Arizona, and also in several colonies in Mexico. For 2 decades, Erastus Snow presided from St. George, traveling throughout these southern communities, exerting his pioneer leadership. I think this is interesting. Snow's colleague, Orson Pratt, only remained in the area for 3 years before going on a mission to Europe. Why do you think he did that? Yes.
He did not like it here.
He didn't like it. He didn't like it here. Orson Pratt was not much of a colonizer. He was a missionary. He was a theologian, okay? He didn't like the practical aspects of colonizing. But Erastus Snow was very well suited for that. So that's why I think, this is Loren Webb's thought, I think Orson Pratt asked to go on that mission. Okay? Okay. The St. George story is well recorded because James G. Blake was appointed to keep a journal. How important is a journal? Very important in my mind. He kept numerous notes and for 4 decades was the community's clerk for almost everything. Others also kept journals such as John D. Lee and Charles Lowell Walker. Among those called to Dixie in 1861 by LDS leaders were about 20 Swiss families led by Daniel Benelli to Santa Clara. Located along the Santa Clara River, the city became famous for its fruit and produce production, with fruit stands lining the main road through town. And Daniel Benelli, of course, later settled down along the Colorado River to run a ferry down there. And at one point, everybody kind of left the area, because of the taxes and that. And at one point, somebody asked Daniel Benelli about his status in the church, and he says, "I didn't leave the church left me." So I thought it was kind of interesting. So, okay. So let's talk about the Great Flood of 1861-62. So pioneers up and down the Virgin River suffered greatly because of this flood. They talk about this Great Flood in California. But the rains began on Christmas Day, 1861, barely a month after St. George colonists arrived. And for 40 days and 40 nights, the rains continued at least part of the day. In Santa Clara, the fort was washed away, and at Fort Harmony, the fort caved in, killing 2 of John D. Lee and Sarah Caroline Lee's children, George A. and Margaret Lee. And there's a tombstone, one tombstone that mentions both of them. It's actually in New Harmony. Several towns had to be relocated to higher ground, including Harmony, Santa Clara, Washington, Grafton, Virgin, and Adventure. Adventure residents moved to Rockville. Area residents continued to battle floods by building various dams, including a pile dam in 1888. It was promptly washed away. And they said it's going to last forever. It only lasted 6 months. It wasn't until the Washington Irrigation Dam was built in 1891 on a stone outcropping that a dam finally remained in place. And I love that dam. I love the Washington Irrigation Dam. That provided water for farmers like my father in the St. George and the Washington fields. And so when it was destroyed by what I consider to be the man-caused Quail Creek dike break on January 1st, 1989, that was a real tragedy. Okay, so people came to Dixie out of religious duty. Mormons settled in groups with clear local leadership, a link to the Central Church in Salt Lake City. Cooperative use of water, organized assignments of land, and homes established in villages were key elements of the Mormon pattern. Brigham Young hoped to occupy every source of water in the region with self-sustaining communities that would host a continuing flow of immigrants. About 40 communities were attempted in Utah's Dixie, and only 20 of them continue today. So we had a 50% failure rate. This area includes, of course, Washington County, Utah, and adjacent areas, the Arizona Strip, Bunkerville, and Mesquite, Nevada, and for a time, the muddy river settlements in Nevada, such as St. Thomas. So where is St. Thomas? Well, it was underwater at Lake Mead until Lake Mead kind of shrunk. And so, yeah, it's risen. Within a year of settlement, St. George had a post office. The Utah Territorial Legislature issued a charter to the city in 1862. Schools had been established in combination with 4 religious congregations. So you have the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 3rd wards. Dams had been built. Cooperatively built canals were in place. A community bowery was erected. A city council had been elected. And several committees had been organized to build irrigation canals and to find timber and build lumber mills. So a lot of great cooperation right at the very beginning here. During this time period, a number of civic structures were built, including the St. George Hall, the St. George LDS Tabernacle, that began in 1871 and was completed in 1874. And I think there's a little bit later date on that. I think it actually was completed in 1876. So I need to correct that. The St. George LDS Temple was begun in 1871 and completed in 1877. So, Brigham Young, why did Brigham Young want a temple here? He wanted one established in his lifetime. And this was probably the best location. This is where his most loyal and experienced followers were living. The place was relatively isolated and free from government and non-member or Gentile interference. Brigham Young wanted his empire to be self-sufficient, and St. George was a key location for travel, supply, and defense. The temple construction reinforced St. George's status as an emerging regional hub. People from southern Utah, Nevada, Arizona, and even Mexico traveled to St. George to enjoy its ordinances. The temple was also the first to be completed in Utah. This is the first in the West. Okay, settlers in Washington, Grafton, and Tokerville were growing cotton, and Brigham Young also felt that if raw cotton could be woven into cloth in Utah, the Latter-day Saints would not have to buy textiles from non-Mormons. So he decided a cotton factory needed to be built in Washington, and it would be a business, not a religious institution. And he told the Southern Mormons that if they would raise the cotton, he would build the factory. By January 1868, the factory was in operation. It remained in operation until 1898. Although it was never a financially successful operation, it pretty well shut down. It was shut down by 1904 for good. It then went into disrepair until a transplant to the area, Norma Canizaro, restored the building. And I got to meet Norma, and she was an amazing woman. And I was really amazed that she put all of her life savings into restoring that building. Today, it's owned by Star Nursery. Construction also began in 1867 on the Washington County Courthouse, now known as the Pioneer Courthouse, and was completed in 1870. So it took 3 years to be complete. The main or the second floor housed county offices, while the basement contained 3 jail cells. and offices for the town marshal / county sheriff. And the third or upper floor contained an assembly room to be used as a courtroom and for other community activities, including teaching school. It was like this was the what do they call those houses that are outside the regular school building? They have a name for it. That's kind of what the county courthouse was used. It was for overflow. This was overflow from the four ward schools. Okay.
Are we allowed to ask questions now, or do you want them at the end?
Towards the end, but you can, if you have a question, stop me.
I just wonder you're on the historical board. What are the plans for the courthouse?
The city of St. George owns the building, and hopefully there's some structural problems in the basement, and so it's been closed since December of when? 2023. It's anyone's guess when it will reopen, but they need to do some restructuring. Structural renovations on it. Yeah, there's some foundation issues, which is really.
It will continue being a historical site and it will continue to show the history?
Yes, we sure hope so.
Well, that's what
We are very hopeful. Yes. Yeah, good question. Okay, so in Washington County, non-Mormons controlled the mining town of Silver Reef. By 1876, 1,000 people lived in Silver Reef. And a lot of these were former residents of the mining town of Pioche, Nevada. The boom town of Silver Reef consisted of saloons, dance halls, grocery stores, restaurants, Masonic and Oddfellows, halls, banks, telegraph office, barber shop, Chinese laundries, boarding houses, homes, and a Catholic church and hospital. Relations between the Mormons and the miners in Silver Reef were cautious, but mostly friendly. Mormon farmers found a really good cash market for their produce in Silver Reef, and cooperation also resulted between Catholic father Lawrence Scanlon and Mormon leader John McFarland, where McFarland offered to have Mormon congregations learn the Catholic Mass and hold Catholic services in the LDS Tabernacle, because no Catholic building existed at the time in Silver Reef. So that was a really good thing. That happened in 1879. And I just thought that was a really neat thing that happened between two different religions. Okay, once the railroad reached Lund, Utah in Iron County, southern Utah cattle ranchers who were raising their cattle in Gunlock, Pine Valley, Hebron, Hamlin, Pinto, Mountain Meadows, Dameron Valley, and the Kolob Plateau in Utah, and on the Arizona Strip, would drive their cattle to Lund to be shipped north and east. The Canaan Stock Company also ran cattle out around Pipe Spring, Arizona. The arrival of cattle threatened much of the grazing areas on which the Native Americans had traditionally depended. Several Navajo raiding parties went into Paiute territory and drove off cattle and horses maintained by the Mormons. So the Mormons responded by building Fort Pierce at the southern end of Warner Valley as a way to defend their cattle. How many of you been out to Fort Pierce? Gosh, most of you. This is awesome. Okay. In February 1874, Brigham Young organized the United Order in St. George and several other communities, which was a communitarian system where participants voluntarily contributed their possessions and labor to the general order, receiving in return from its holdings what they needed to live on. How long did it last? Less than a year. Nobody really wanted to go into this. We're talking about rugged individualists, okay? We like our rugged individualism. So that just pretty much disappeared. Okay, so cultural events. Because Washington County communities were isolated from the rest of the world, residents came up with their own cultural events, such as building the St. George Opera House for theater and music. And Santa Clara was the home of a famous brass band. A number of newspapers started, including I can't even say it, Vapricula. There we go. The Mineral Cactus, our Dixie Times, the Silver Reef Echo, and the Washington County News, among others. The Vapricula was handwritten. It was a handwritten newspaper. Okay. St. George City built the Cottonwood Spring Pipe Project, completed in 1898, with other upgrades in 1907, 1920, and 1937. Finally, we get piped water coming into St. George with no breaks, no other pollution coming into that pipeline. So that was awesome. I can tell you that growing up and drinking Pine Valley water was so good. And when Quail Lake water came in, you could tell the difference. You could really tell the difference. Okay. Enterprise Reservoir took 16 years to build. It was the brainchild of Orson Huntsman from when the project started in 1891. The Hurricane Canal was another project that began with a canal that was built in 1891 and completed in 1904. The work included a diversion dam on the Virgin River, a 12-foot wide canal grade with an 8-foot wide by 4-foot deep channel, and a series of flumes and trestles, and that is what made possible the town of Hurricane, Utah. Had it not been for that canal, Hurricane, Utah would probably not exist. Other projects included the Gunlock Reservoir. That was constructed by the city of St. George, the St. George Santa Clara Canal Company, the Santa Clara Canal Company, the Bloomington Irrigation Company, and the Seep Ditch Company. That was begun and completed in 1 year, in 1970. The Hurricane Canal Company completed Kolob Reservoir in 1956. Baker Dam was completed in 1953 and is maintained by the Baker Dam Reservoir Association. Construction on Quail Creek Reservoir by the Washington County Water Conservancy District began in November of ┬ĀD3. The reservoir dike was completed in April of '84. The dam east of the dike was completed in January of 1985. Impoundment started in April of '85, and it leaked ever since it was built. And then on January 1st, 1989, the dike broke, sending 25,000 acre-feet of water downriver and causing about $12 million worth of damage. The good thing is that no deaths resulted in the man-caused flood failure. The dike was rebuilt in 1990 with a roller-compacted concrete dam. And I covered that for the Spectrum newspaper as a reporter. Sand Hollow Reservoir was completed in March 2002 and is operated primarily as a water storage and recovery project by the Conservancy District. Because of continued and steady growth of the county, the Washington County Water Conservancy District is pushing to build a Lake Powell pipeline to bring water to the county at a cost of $2.2 billion, and that price is probably raised somewhat. Whether it's built or not will be a really good question. I think it's stalled right now. I think the project is kind of stalled. The creation of Zion National Park. This was another major outside influence that interrupted the isolation of Utah's Dixie. This was created by the federal government of a canyon of the Virgin River. It became known as Mukuntuweap National Monument north of Springdale in 1909. Two associates of explorer John Wesley Powell, Clarence Dutton, and Frederick Dellenbaugh helped bring Zion Canyon to national attention. Eventually, the name was changed to Zion National Park, and it helped bring world tourism to Washington County, especially with completion of the Zion Tunnel in 1930. The Utah Parks Company was established. They established accommodations within the park. They began transporting visitors to Zion, Bryce, and Grand Canyon National Parks. And then the National Park Service built the Zion Mount Carmel Tunnel, highway and tunnel to accommodate Utah Park Company's buses. And you can see by 1995 there were 3 million annual visitors to the park. In 2021 it was 5.4 million annual visitors, and it's raised ever since. It just continues to grow. Another really, really cool thing that really ended the isolation of Washington County was the Arrowhead Trail in the 1920s and 30s from Los Angeles to Salt Lake City brought national attention to Washington County. Then it was later designated as Highway 91, which enabled St. George to become a major tourism center. Motels and restaurants sprang up along the highway in town. And I remember if you wanted to travel from St. George to Salt Lake City, you had to go through nearly every town in Utah in the mid part of, and it took 8 hours. It took 8 hours to get to State Street in Salt Lake City. I got so excited when I got to see State Street and see that Capitol building, the state capitol right in front of us, because that's where it ended. So other roads were built from Grafton to Kanab and to Pine Valley, Mountain Meadow, and Enterprise. And Interstate 15 through the Virgin River Gorge opened on December 14th, 1973. And that effectively opened freeway traffic through Washington County, Utah. I remember traveling down there on my motorcycle before the freeway ever opened with my buddies, Mike Connell, and Tyler Esplin, and there was one other person. I think it was Curtis Thompson. Yeah, so Curtis Thompson. We went down there. We got almost to Cedar Pocket on our motorcycles. It was a dirt road back then. Anyway, it was just kind of exciting to travel down there, and they had these humps. They had these culverts that you went over. Anyway, that was what I remember prior to the freeway opening. Okay, so aviation in Washington County. An early airport southeast of Washington City opened in 1924, and in 1948 it became a Civil Aeronautics Authority facility. But then it was shut down in 1955. Another airport opened on the West Black Hill in the 1920s. It eventually became the St. George City Airport from 1937 to 2011. Guess what? The St. George City Airport opened in 2011 at the old CAA airport location near the Arizona border. It used to be where they had those mini planes flying out. So the remote planes, thank you, the remote planes, airplanes, yeah. So kind of a roundabout way of going back with our airport space. During the Great Depression, Dixie College professor Juanita Brooks devised a plan through the Works Progress Administration to employ Mormon women in Dixie to type copies of the original diaries of Washington County pioneers and later residents. So those transcribed diaries and journals are found at Brigham Young University, Utah Tech University, and the Huntington Library in California. The Civil Conservation Corps also employed young men to work in the following Washington County locations: Vail, Gunlock, Pinto, Enterprise, Washington City, and Leeds. And in 1933, Dixie College became a state institution because the LDS Church just couldn't afford to fund it. And so it was the St. George Chamber of Commerce, organized in 1920, worked to save Dixie College in 1933. Electrical power and telephone service came to southern Utah. Around 1916, the Southern Utah Power Company began operating in St. George and a number of other communities. In 1946, the Dixie Rural Electric Association, the Escalante Valley Rural Electric Association, and the Littlefield Rural Electric Association were organized to provide electrical service to rural residents. In 1974, Dixie REA merged with the Littlefield REA, and 4 years later joined with Escalante Valley REA. Membership grew to include Burrell, Modena, Pine Valley, Bloomington Hills, Washington Fields, and Littlefield, Arizona. And they changed their name. It got too long for them. Dixie Escalante REA, Rural Electric Association. Now it's just known as Dixie Power Company. Its main office is still in the thriving metropolis of Burrell, Utah, but they do have another really fabulous office in Bloomington, Utah, which really should be their main office. I mean, that's where all the growth is. In 1904, telephone equipment was installed by the Southern Utah Telephone Company. They linked St. George with Tokerville and Cedar City. In 1930, the Mountain States Telephone and Telegraph Company purchased Southern Utah Telephone Company, and they expanded long-distance service. Where was their office?
Tabernacle.
On Tabernacle and 100 East. Very good. Okay, during the 1950s, the Cold War between the U.S. and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, prompted the U.S. to begin conducting above-ground nuclear tests that periodically sent radiation fallout over Washington County, Utah. Residents seemed to suffer more leukemia and other cancer deaths than normal. Many felt the government betrayed their trust. Eventually, the downwinders benefited on October 15, 1990, when President George Bush signed into law the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. I'm one of those downwinders. I went with former Enterprise Mayor Lee Bracken on a tour of the Nevada test site. And both Lee Bracken and I, we went with a group of Mesquite City residents, and they all thought it was just wonderful. Lee Bracken and I came back, and we were totally disillusioned. So, I don't know. I just didn't trust the government on that. So, okay, so Hilldale, Utah, and Colorado City, Arizona, earlier known as Short Creek, Arizona, became a settling place for the polygamous community, meaning a man who had more than one wife, in the 1920s. The tide of Mormon fundamentalism for Short Creek came when Isaac Carling went to Salt Lake City to work in the Baldwin radio plant, and that's out in Mill Creek, by the way, and I've been to that site. There's a restaurant in the front. I recommend you go to the restaurant and then walk back. It's still there. All that facility, the facilities are still there intact. Nathaniel Baldwin was an important Utah inventor and industrialist who became the financial patron of the fundamentalist movement. Increased pressure from the LDS Church on Mormon fundamentalists to end the practice of plural marriage served to polarize fundamentalists, and many looked to Short Creek as the future home of the movement. In October of 1936, the Declaration of United Trust was filed and recorded in Kingman, Arizona, legally creating a trust and taking a step toward a united order lifestyle for area polygamists. In 1942, a new United Effort Plan Trust was recorded in Kingman that strengthened and made more clear the legality of the trust. The decades of the 1940s and 50s saw considerable conflict between fundamentalists and government officials, as well as internal conflict. In 1953, the Arizona state government conducted a raid on Short Creek. By the way, the residents of Short Creek were tipped off to the raid, so they knew it was coming. This would represent the last legal prosecution of fundamentalists affiliated with the Short Creek community for practicing plural marriage. It became quite an embarrassment to the state government. So in 1961, an oil road was finished from Hurricane, Utah to Fredonia, Arizona, and that opened access to Short Creek and in a symbolic way exposed the fundamentalists to the world. The name of the community was officially changed the following year to Colorado City for the Arizona side and Hilldale for the Utah side. Hilldale was incorporated as a Utah town in 1962, and Colorado City was incorporated in 1985. In 1983, I was working at the Spectrum, and I was assigned to cover both Hilldale and Colorado City. I covered them for 5 years. I was the first reporter to ever cover them. It was an experience. It was a really interesting experience I don't have time to talk about. Another group of people who have remained somewhat isolated are the Shivwit Band of Paiutes in the western corner of Washington County. In recent times, the band was organized as one of 5 among southern Utah Paiutes. They lost their tribal status in the 1960s when the U.S. government policy shifted towards assimilation instead of dealing with Indians as separate tribes. After lengthy negotiations, the Shivwits regained tribal status in 1982. Between 1978 and 1980, the band moved to Sand Hill, which is on the North Ivans Bench above the meadows where they previously lived. The federal government built some homes and a community center there. There are about 100 Shivwit Indians in the community. As you're well aware, they have the convenience store over there, the best gas prices in town. You can't beat their gas prices. And they're building a new community center, a 2-story community center there. Religious diversity in Washington County has continued to grow since 1958 when the Catholic Church dedicated a church in St. George. In 1980, Roger and Katie Hansen moved to St. George to reorganize the Presbyterian congregation. The St. George Baptist Mission opened a meeting house on 300 South and 600 East in St. George in 1964, just down the street from where I grew up. A community Baptist church was also opened in 1961. One of the longtime pastors there was Reverend Alex Wilkie, who retired in 1992, and I had the great opportunity to interview Alex Wilkie as part of the oral history program with the Washington County Historical Society. In 2022, there were 25 churches advertising services in Washington County. A modern pioneer in Washington County who's contributed in various ways included Orville Hafen, who became president of the Utah Senate and became the main sponsor of a bill creating the state park system, one of which would be Snow Canyon State Park. He was also instrumental in helping to see the construction of the Dixie Red Hills Golf Course in 1965. And truly, if you build it, they will come, and they have. Look at all the golf courses since then. But he was really a visionary. He happened to represent the Washington County Dairy Association, of which my dad was president at one point, and my dad loved Orville Hafen. He thought he was a really great man. St. George restaurant owner Dick Hammer of Dick's Cafe and motel owner Brown Hale helped bring the Hollywood movie industry to the St. George area between 1953 and 1983, which helped publicize the Dixie area. Really hated to see Dick's Cafe go. 3 new industrial parks were created beginning in 1961 with the St. George Industrial Park in the northern part of the city, followed by the Mill Creek Industrial Park on the east, and the Fort Pierce Industrial Park on the southern city boundary. The first subdivisions, okay, were Terracore, Bloomington, and Bloomington Hills subdivisions created by Clark and Ellis Ivory, and Roger Boyer, and Clifton, Franklin, and Glendon Johnson. And then Alan Coombs developed the Green Valley Recreation and Resort Community on the west side of St. George. I'm just going to kind of skim through some of this other. The Red Cliffs Desert Reserve, of course, was established in 1996. It has about 69,000 acres. It's coordinated with BLM, with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, with state agencies as well. Pretty good-sized facility. Sun River opened, of course, south of Bloomington. This was a project begun by developer Darcy Stewart in 1998. It's pretty well filled in, you know. So it's really substantial facility. At Dixie College, the decision was made to move from Main Street to 700 East, and a new gym was completed in 1957, making it the very first building at the new facility, which now is known as Utah Tech. The creation of the Washington County School District. So these 19 school districts were consolidated into one in June of 1915. Today, well, as of February 2023, there were 39,643 students in K through 12, and it's still growing. St. George Regional Hospital. In 2003, they opened a second campus on River Road. Then in 2009, the Dixie Regional Health and Performance Center opened. In 2013, they opened a Neurosciences Institute. In January of 2021, the hospital changed its name to St. George Regional Hospital. In Hurricane, the county-owned Purgatory Correctional Facility was completed in 1998 at a cost of $11.5 million. Has 150 employees and a full-time medical clinic. Of course, the flood of 2005 resulted in 25 homes being swept downriver. That was devastating, right? Really, really devastating. Also, Dixie State University, the Utah System of Higher Education voted unanimously to recommend a name change to Utah Tech University. The state legislature approved with condition that the main St. George campus will be named Dixie Campus of Utah. The name change took effect July 1st, 2022. Advocates supporting the name change asserted the name Dixie had ties to the Confederacy. Opponents of the name change felt the name Dixie was important to the area's heritage and is separate from the history of slaves, so pretty controversial. We had the St. George Temple open house and rededication dates. We had the Red Cliffs Temple dedication. 2 temples. There's only 4 places in Utah where we have 2 temples in one city. Building permits. You can see, I don't know if you can see up there, but building permits just keep increasing, okay, from 1994 to 2023. A lot of the growth has come from the South Block. These are just a couple of things that are pretty interesting and significant. The Big Shot Sporting Bar, driving range, and putting course. The Paparazzi Jewelry Warehouse is huge. And that just started as one small store, by the way. Desert Color, and that's really taking off at Exit 2. This still hasn't taken place yet. The Marriott Bonvoy Atara Resort next to Desert Color. The Southern Parkway is opening up a lot of development on State Route 7. Desert Canyons Community. D.R. Horton, this is Living Subdivision in Long Valley. Yogi Bear's Jellystone Park Camp Resort in Hurricane. Exit 11 construction on I-15 started. Okay, and then the Tokerville Parkway is still under construction, still hasn't opened yet as far as I know. And the Black Desert Resort Project in Ivins, just a huge mammoth project with a golf course. I mean, it's just massive. Okay, so that brings us to the very end. What is one important limiting factor to continued growth in Washington County? Water. What are the benefits of a constantly growing and increasing metropolitan population in Washington County?
Tax revenue,
Theater?
taxes.
Taxes. Okay. Okay. Lots of money here, lots of good salaries. Okay. Restaurants. Okay. What would be might be the drawbacks to a high annual population growth rates in the county? Traffic jams, crime, increased crime,
Crime and accidents.
and accidents.
And drugs and all of the
Yep.
trafficking, human trafficking and drugs are coming
Yes.
from California.
All of that. All of that. What quality of life issues will we as county residents have to contend with in the next 50 years?
Air quality.
Air quality. Okay. What else? Anything else? What? Okay, water. Water is really the big issue here. Ivans has already, they've taken a position where they're not allowing a lot of new building permits. Is that right, Chris? Okay, maybe not then. At least I'd heard that they talk about it then. They haven't taken a firm policy. Okay. Okay. Anything else? Any other questions or comments?
I just have one question. When you were doing all of the reservoirs, I didn't know. Where's Baker Reservoir?
Baker is on State Route 18, and it's between Vale and Brookside.
Okay.
It's south of Central.
Okay.
It's actually, when I said Vale and Brookside, it's between Brookside and Central.
So is
Brookside and
Adventure
Central.
another name for
What's that?
Adventure?
Adventure was a small, tiny community that was just about a mile downriver from Rockville.
Okay.
And Scott Hershey and I went out, and we think we know where the original site is. So he's another local resident.
I haven't heard of Heber community. It's mentioned twice here.
Heberville?
Hebron.
Oh, Hebron. Hebron is a ghost town. Doesn't exist. The only thing that exists there is a cemetery. The only thing that exists there is a cemetery. It is about 6 miles west of Enterprise, and then 1 mile north on Old Hebron Road. It's worth going. It's worth going out there.
You know, one of the things that we didn't discuss, what was the politics back from when they were here, the 300 and something families?
Mm-hmm.
What was the politics like? Was it the same as was in Salt Lake City? I mean, did they bring all the same parties and the same? Did they have the?
There was the People's Party and the Liberal Party existed prior to statehood. Then once statehood came, they became Americanized, and it became Democrats and Republicans. And Washington County has traditionally been a Republican county, but there have been Democratic candidates run for office, on a regular basis. But the Republicans have pretty much been in the majority in the county. So, any other questions? Yes.
Why is nothing being done about the water?
Well, that's a really good question.
I personally conserve, but why doesn't the government put something in place? It's been a problem for a really, really long time. I'm a newcomer. I'm here
Okay.
6 years, but I hear this all the time. And why isn't some measures being taken?
Well, I can tell you one measure right now. The Washington County Water Conservancy District has an increased rate. If you use a lot more water, then you get charged more. Okay, and so my monthly rate, I just got my St. George City utility bill was $706. And it was because we have a lot of grass and we have a garden, and I was just flabbergasted. I was just floored. And so that's, I'm being hit by that now. And so more than likely, I'm probably going to have to convert more and more. I do have some desert landscaping. You had a question, Rebecca.
Well, I was going to make a comment. The Conservancy District is actually paying people to change from grass to rocks.
That's right. That's right.
Desert landscape. So
Yes.
you can make a pretty good amount of money if you do that.
Yes. So, and I think I'm probably going to have to do that. I know I'm going to have to do that eventually. I'm just kind of, I like my grass somewhat for my grandkids, but I know I'm going to have to convert. Yes?
I just wonder why something like circulating hot water pumps would be required on new construction. We had that where I used to live, and I turn my water on, it's 4 minutes until I can get some hot water.
Yeah.
That would make a big difference if they required the builders to do something like that. It seems that there are measures that could be taken that aren't being taken.
I think you're right, too. And I was...
Hard water that would make that not feasible because of our hard water.
Well, let me ask you, let me interject here because you ask about government policies. I will say on the county level and on the city level, there are initiatives that are put in place. If you live in an HOA, who lives in an HOA, right? Okay, if it's a grandfathered HOA, they encourage people to convert grass to xeriscaping. But if it's a new development, all of these new developments, the restriction for the amount of grass that you can have per unit is drastically reduced. So you cannot go out and have a new development and have acres of grass, and you are limited to certain types of trees and bushes. And they're really pushing the xeriscaping, and that's what the garden is up on the Red Hill for people to go and look at to say, this is what we recommend that you have here, because all of these are ways to save water. Plus, the Water Conservancy District is they're drilling more wells, and there were 11 wells up that had been drilled up around Gunlock. And the reason they never used them was there was too high of an arsenic level in them. New technology now has made it possible, and they've just opened up that processing plant about a year ago.
Right.
And now they can use all of that water that was previously unusable. All of your public spaces, golf courses, public lands and stuff are all using...
irrigation water.
What do they call it? It's non-potable water.
Non-potable
you can't
water.
drink it. So if you play golf like I do not ever put your fingers in your mouth because it's terrible water. But so the government is very aware of this as far as the county government and city government, and every city has their own policy. But
And there's two reservoir projects that I think are going, and that's the Warner Valley project and Tokerville.
Yes.
Tokerville water projects. Those two are going to be. I think, are going to become reality. So yes.
Dr. Booth did a presentation on the water history here at this, and it was absolutely fantastic. But I sat next to a lady when I came to that presentation, and she's in the original area of St. George. And she has a spring in her yard, as do other people. And the city or the government hasn't needed water desperately enough, or they could come to each of these people and purchase that spring water. That spring water is still available. And so I looked at it as a good backup system.
Yes.
Our government, in their conservation, has a backup that most of us aren't aware of. We don't know of people that have springs in their yards because we live in developed HOAs and so forth. But these people, many have springs in their yard.
Yeah.
It could be a backup water system if we needed it. So I think it's probably a little brighter than we think it is.
Yeah.
A little brighter.
I was going to mention that the city also has impact fees for new developments, and I think those impact fees have increased. I just feel like sometimes, as a longtime resident, sometimes I feel like I'm being penalized. And So, but I know I'm going to have to convert, and Las Vegas has become very stringent. They don't allow, I don't think, any new, you have to have pretty much zero escaping if you put anything in Las Vegas. They've really become proactive. So, thank you so much. Oh, go ahead.
That's why the park system's been so important too.
Yes.
Yes.
Is because now we can't have there's so many small yards. There's no yards for kids. And so parks.
So city parks are really important. I live right next to a city park, and I see how important they are, especially to people who live in apartments. They don't. You're absolutely right. They don't have any access to to grass or lawns or, much real, I don't know, private backyards, if you will. You had a question or a comment?
Yes, between the Shivwitz group today and as you're going up to Gunlock, there are a number of old or the remains of structures, homes, it looks like, maybe 15 or 20 on either side of the highway. And then there's the remains of a large stone building.
Church.
That's the old schoolhouse church building. That's in the old original Shivwitz community. When I was growing up, that's where the Shivwitz community was. Yeah. Then they moved to the new facility and left a lot of those old buildings that are just still standing.
A church?
It was a combined, I think it was a combined church schoolhouse.
It was a school community center.
It was a community center and a schoolhouse.
My grandfather was a school teacher out there, him and his wife, and so they were there in the 1920s where they taught the girls homemaking skills and cooking and educated them. So
Yeah.
that was one of the reasons there.
Yeah. It's a cool building, by the way.
What are the plans for that area?
You'd have to talk to the Shivwit Indian Reservation about that. I don't know what their plans.
It seems like gradually it's disappearing.
Yes, kind of is. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you coming out to listen.
Thank you for Loren. Yes. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Loren. It was wonderful. Lots of information, lots of things to think about. And so to end that, if you'd like to take a tour and go through the museum, you're more than welcome to stay. We have our event next month is going to be Jerry Atkin, going to talk about the Newcastle Reclamation Project that he wrote a book about. So it's on the third Saturday at 10 o'clock. So thank you again for coming, and we appreciate it. Come back and see us again. Thank you. Thank you.